Miss Marple Murder at the Autumn Pumpkin Show. Welcome back to Cafe Tales, my friends. I'm Ailey, and it truly warms my heart to see you joining me again this evening. I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and did you have a peaceful day? Share it in the comments, and remember to subscribe for a new mystery every day. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1, Bunting Brass and the Blue Ribbon. The village of St. Mary Mead had dressed itself in its finest autumn colors for the occasion. Bunting in shades of orange, russet, and gold fluttered from every lamppost along the high street, and the village green had been transformed into a scene that might have graced a painting by some artist fond of rural pleasures. The brass band, positioned beneath the old oak tree, was working its way through a spirited rendition of Sussex by the Sea, and the air carried the mingled scents of hot toffee apples, wood smoke from the roasting chestnuts, and that peculiar earthy perfume that belongs exclusively to autumn afternoons. Miss Jane Marple stood near the entrance to the produce tent, her keen blue eyes taking in the scene with the sort of quiet attention that those who knew her well had learned to respect. She wore her good gray coat and a sensible felt hat, and carried her knitting bag over one arm, though there would be little opportunity for knitting this afternoon. The annual autumn show was one of the great events in the village calendar, and one did not knit when there was so much to observe. "Jane, my dear, there you are." Lady Bantry swept up in a flurry of Harris tweed and enthusiasm, her cheeks pink from the October air. "I've been looking everywhere for you. You simply must come and see the pumpkins. Positively enormous, some of them. Ephraim Prow has entered one he's calling Goliath, and he's been boasting about it to anyone who will listen. Has he indeed?" murmured Miss Marple, allowing herself to be led toward the great striped tent that housed the produce exhibition. Inside, the tent was a cathedral of agricultural achievement. Rows of trestle tables groaned under the weight of nature's bounty. Marrows that resembled green torpedoes, onions as large and golden as small suns, carrots arranged in military precision, and tomatoes that gleamed like rubies under the canvas roof. But it was the far end of the tent that drew the eye, and the crowd. There, roped off behind a velvet cord more commonly seen in museums, stood the giant pumpkins. 3 of them squatted beneath protective card cages, each a monument to horticultural ambition. The largest was indeed Ephraim Prow's Goliath, a massive orange sphere that must have weighed upward of 200 pounds. Beside it sat a slightly smaller but more perfectly shaped specimen with a placard reading, "Duchess Mrs. Ekins." The third, from a farm outside the village, was respectable but clearly outclassed. "Mrs. Ekins has done remarkably well," observed Miss Marple, studying the squat, beautifully colored pumpkin with interest. "I remember her late husband used to grow vegetables. She's carrying on the tradition most creditably." "Oh, Ivy's quite the marvel," agreed Lady Bantry, "though between you and me, Jane, Ephraim Prow has been perfectly beastly about it, suggesting all sorts of things about how she managed to grow such a fine specimen. Really, the man's impossible." As if summoned by mention of his name, Ephraim Prow himself appeared. A burly man in his 50s with a face like cured leather and the build of someone who spent his life wrestling with the earth. He was holding forth to a small audience about the particular virtues of Goliath. "Proper feeding, that's what it takes," he announced, his voice carrying across the tent. "None of your shop-bought fertilizers. I use my own mixture, developed over 30 years. That's why Goliath there stands head and shoulders above the competition." "Head and shoulders?" A sharp female voice cut through his monologue. "Your Goliath sprawling like a drunkard, Ephraim Prow, while my Duchess sits neat as a crown jewel." Mrs. Ivy Ekins was a small, wiry woman of perhaps 60, with iron gray hair pulled back severely and eyes that snapped with intelligence and no small amount of temper. She stood with her arms folded, regarding Prow with evident disdain. Size matters in pumpkins, Ivy, retorted Prow, his face reddening. Always has, always will. Judges know that. Judges know quality when they see it, shot back Mrs. Ekins, which is more than can be said for certain persons. Before the argument could escalate further, a new voice intervened, smooth and slightly oily. Now let's not quarrel before the judging. There's glory enough for everyone, I'm sure. Abner Pike emerged from behind the display tables, a thin man in a too-new jacket, his hands perpetually in motion, as though washing themselves in air. He was the village's traveling merchant, dealing in fertilizers, sprays, seeds, and sundry supplies for the keen gardener. After all, both of you have used Pike's premium plant food, haven't you? Credit where credit's due. Mrs. Ekins's mouth tightened. I've used good, honest manure and compost, Mr. Pike, as any sensible person would. Ah, but my products have their place, said Pike, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. Modern science, Mrs. Ekins, we can't stand still, can we? Miss Marple observed this exchange with the detached interest of someone watching players in a theatrical performance. There was something about Mr. Pike that reminded her of a man she'd once known in Much Benham, a commercial traveler who'd later been caught selling adulterated goods. The same rather too smooth manner, the same tendency to insert himself into conversations where he wasn't particularly wanted. A young woman appeared at Mrs. Ekins's elbow, bright-eyed and eager. This, Miss Marple knew, was Kitty Drew, one of the younger members of the Women's Institute, known for her skill at carving lanterns and her devoted attachment to Mrs. Ekins. Mrs. Ekins, I finished arranging your card just as you wanted, she said breathlessly, and I've made sure the ribbon shows properly. Thank you. Kitty, dear, said Mrs. Ekins, her voice softening, you're a good girl. The church clock struck 3, and a ripple of anticipation ran through the crowd. Oh, here comes Horace Bellamy, said Lady Bantry, gripping Miss Marple's arm. The judging's about to begin. Horace Bellamy was a man who understood his own importance and expected others to understand it too. As chairman of the allotment committee and chief judge of the produce competition for the past 15 years, he had developed a manner that combined pomposity with petty tyranny in equal measure. He was a stout man in his 60s with a florid face and small, calculating eyes that missed nothing when it came to finding fault. He entered the tent with all the ceremony of a monarch entering his throne room, accompanied by 2 junior judges who trailed in his wake like nervous courtiers. A steward hurried forward with a clipboard and pencil. Ladies and gentlemen, announced Bellamy in a voice trained to carry across allotment sites and committee rooms, the judging of the giant pumpkins will now commence. He approached Prow's Goliath first, walking around it slowly, hands clasped behind his back. He bent down, peered at the stem, prodded the flesh with one stubby finger, and made a non-committal noise. The junior judges scribbled notes. Substantial, he pronounced. Very substantial indeed, though I detect some irregularity in the ribbing here. Prow, uneven watering perhaps? Prow's face darkened, but he held his tongue. Bellamy moved to the 3rd entry, dispatched it with barely a glance and a curt adequate, and then positioned himself before Mrs. Ekins's Duchess with an expression that suggested he was about to perform a particularly delicate piece of surgery. Now then, he said, circling the pumpkin slowly, color is good, shape is regular, but the true test, ladies and gentlemen, is in the freshness of the cut stem. A properly harvested pumpkin should show certain characteristics that cannot be faked. The stem must be cleanly cut and properly corked, sealing in the sap and preventing deterioration. Any moisture, any softness indicates poor husbandry. With a flourish that suggested years of practice, Horace Bellamy moistened his right thumb with his tongue, a habit so ingrained it appeared almost unconscious. He bent down and rubbed the thumb firmly across the cut stem of the Duchess, then brought it to his nose and sniffed with the air of a connoisseur sampling a fine wine. Lady Bantry leaned close to Miss Marple. "He always does that, perfectly revolting if you ask me." Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes had sharpened, fixed on the pumpkin stem with sudden intense focus. There was something about the surface of that cut peduncle, something that caught the light in a way that seemed not quite right. But before she could pursue the thought, Bellamy straightened up, preparing to deliver his verdict. "Well," he began, and then paused. His hand went to his throat. "Well, I must say," his voice faltered. The florid color of his face had taken on a grayish tinge. He swayed slightly and his eyes widened with what might have been surprise or sudden comprehension. "Bitter," he muttered, so quietly that only those nearest could hear. "Bitter taste!" And then, as the brass band outside struck up a cheerful march and the autumn sun slanted through the tent opening, Horace Bellamy clutched at his chest, gave a strange rattling gasp, and collapsed heavily beside the winning pumpkin called Duchess. The screaming started almost immediately. Chapter 2. A Stem, a Thumb, and a Fall. The confusion that followed Horace Bellamy's collapse was of the peculiar kind that afflicts gatherings of respectable people confronted with sudden calamity. Several women shrieked, though not Mrs. Ekins, who had gone perfectly white and rigid. Ephraim Prow began shouting for someone to fetch a doctor, apparently forgetting that Dr. Haydock was already present and making his way swiftly through the crowd. The two junior judges stood frozen, their clipboards hanging uselessly at their sides. "Stand back, please. Give the man air." Dr. Haydock's voice cut through the panic with professional authority. He was a lean, sardonic man in his 50s who had served St. Mary Mead for nearly 3 decades and had seen most varieties of human frailty and misfortune. He knelt beside Bellamy's prone form, his fingers seeking a pulse at the throat. Miss Marple had moved forward with Lady Bantry, but not to crowd around the fallen judge. Instead, while all eyes were fixed on the drama of life and possible death, she positioned herself near the pumpkin called Duchess, her gaze moving with methodical precision over its surface, the display card, and particularly the cut stem that Bellamy had so recently examined with his moistened thumb. "Is he—" Lady Bantry couldn't finish the question. Dr. Haydock rose to his feet, his expression grave. "I'm afraid he's gone." Very rapid. No warning signs that I could detect. A fresh wave of exclamations swept through the tent. Inspector Slack, who had been sampling the refreshments near the tier, arrived in a fluster of official importance. He was a large red-faced man who combined genuine conscientiousness with an unfortunate tendency to miss subtleties. "Heart attack, was it, Doctor?" Slack pulled out his notebook with the air of a man determined to write something official, even if there was nothing particularly official to write. Possibly. The symptoms would be consistent with cardiac arrest, though the rapidity is somewhat unusual. Haydock frowned, looking down at Bellamy's contorted features. "No external injury. He complained of a bitter taste, I believe. Someone said—" "I heard him," volunteered Kitty Drew, who was clinging to Mrs. Ekins's arm. "He said bitter quite clearly just before he fell." "Excitement of the judging," suggested Prow, his earlier bluster somewhat deflated. Man's heart couldn't take it. All that bending and sniffing, not natural at his age. "Horace Bellamy was as healthy as a horse," snapped Mrs. Ekins, finding her voice at last, though it trembled slightly. "Saw him 3 days ago walking from the village to Gossington Hall without so much as breathing hard." "This is not natural?" "Not natural at all." Inspector Slack's head swiveled toward her. "What are you suggesting, Mrs. Ekins?" "I'm not suggesting anything." Her voice was sharp now, defensive. "I'm merely stating a fact. The man was in robust health." "Apoplexy can strike anyone," said Pike, appearing at the edge of the group. His hands were working themselves again, fingers twisting together. "I've seen it happen. One moment a man's upright, the next he's down. Terrible thing. But there it is, an act of God." "Really?" Act of God or act of nature? Dr. Haydock interjected. We'll need to move him, Slack. You'll want statements from those who were present, I imagine, though I don't see what purpose it serves. No sign of violence, no indication of anything untoward. Just routine, Doctor. Just routine. Slack was already scanning the assembled crowd with an air of determined officialdom. Now then, who was standing closest when it happened? Several voices answered at once. Prow had been near the weighing stand. Pike had been hovering somewhere near the display tables. Mrs. Ekins had been standing by her card. Kitty had been arranging lanterns at the children's table. The stewards had been managing the velvet ropes, while this cacophony of information washed over Inspector Slack's notebook. Miss Marple bent slightly, ostensibly to retrieve her knitting bag, which had slipped from her arm. In that moment, screened by the bulk of Lady Bantry and the general confusion, her gloved hand touched the cut stem of the Duchess. It came away with a faint, sticky residue. She straightened slowly, her expression unchanged, and carefully removed her glove, folding it so that the damp mark was contained within. The glove went into her knitting bag with the careful precision of someone putting away something valuable. Jane? Lady Bantry had noticed her friend's preoccupation. Are you quite all right? You've gone rather pale. I am perfectly well, Dolly. Perhaps a little warm. The tent is rather close, don't you think? Dreadfully close, and with poor Bellamy lying there. Jane, do you think we ought to leave? There's nothing we can do, after all. But Miss Marple's attention had shifted to Bellamy's hands, now visible as the doctor and a steward prepared to cover the body with a cloth someone had fetched. The right hand lay palm up, and there on the cuff of his jacket sleeve was a small smudge of color. Greenish, faint, but distinct. In a moment, dear, she murmured. I should like to hear what Inspector Slack makes of all this. What Inspector Slack was making of it appeared to be very little. He had taken statements from Prow, who complained that Bellamy had been about to judge unfairly, from Mrs. Ekins, who maintained stiffly that she had been nowhere near the judge at the crucial moment, and from Pike, who offered elaborate theories about cardiac episodes brought on by autumn chill and overexertion. Did anyone see Mr. Bellamy consume anything before the judging? Slack asked, working through his mental checklist of possibilities. Food or drink that might have disagreed with him. Various heads shook. Bellamy had taken tea earlier, a currant bun from the refreshment table. Nothing unusual. Nobody noticed anything odd about his behavior beforehand. Bellamy had been his usual pompous self, according to those who cared to comment. Overbearing as always, full of his own importance. Miss Marple cleared her throat gently. Inspector Slack, if I might ask a question. Slack turned with the air of a man prepared to humor an elderly lady who couldn't possibly have anything useful to contribute. Yes, Miss Marple? The tent is posted as a no-smoking area, I believe, for fire safety. That's correct. What of it? I merely wondered whether the stewards had noticed anyone disregarding that rule. Tobacco smoke has rather a distinctive scent. Slack consulted with the nearest steward, a retired army man named Giles, who took his duties seriously. Absolutely not, Miss Marple. I was watching carefully. Nobody smoked in this tent. I'd have noticed immediately. I'm sure you would have, said Miss Marple mildly. Thank you. Lady Bantry gave her friend a puzzled look but said nothing. She had learned over the years that when Jane Marple asked seemingly irrelevant questions, they generally turned out to be remarkably relevant indeed. Dr. Haydock was conferring quietly with Inspector Slack near the tent entrance. Miss Marple couldn't hear their words, but she could see Haydock's frown, the way he kept glancing back at Bellamy's body with an expression that suggested professional unease. Slack, she heard the doctor say finally, his voice carrying just far enough. I'd like to take a proper look at him. Something about the rapidity, the symptoms. I'm not entirely satisfied. You're not suggesting foul play, Doctor? Slack's voice rose in alarm. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm simply saying I prefer to be thorough. The man's dead, Slack. There's no harm in being certain about why. While they debated, Abner Pike had sidled over to the Duchess, ostensibly to examine the card. His hands hovered near the stem. Best secure this properly, he announced to no one in particular. Stop the sap from running. Wouldn't want Mrs. Ekins' prize specimen to deteriorate. Leave it alone! Mrs. Ekins' voice cracked like a whip. Don't touch my pumpkin, Abner Pike. Pike's hands jerked back as though stung. I was only trying to help, Ivy. No call to snap. I said leave it. She moved protectively in front of the Duchess, her eyes blazing. Bad enough what's happened without you interfering. The hostility between them was palpable, surprising in its intensity. Miss Marple filed this away along with everything else she'd observed. The wet gloss on the stem, the greenish smudge on Bellamy's cuff, Pike's eagerness to touch the pumpkin, Mrs. Ekins' fierce protectiveness, and above all that faint, sharp scent hanging in the air. That was not quite tobacco smoke, not quite anything she could immediately place, but which triggered a memory of something old. Something from years past when gardens were treated differently and remedies were mixed at home. Jane. You're looking very thoughtful, observed Lady Bantry. Am I, dear? I suppose I am. Death is always thought-provoking, even when it appears to be natural. Appears to be. Miss Marple drew her knitting bag closer. Perhaps I am being fanciful. The heat of the tent, as I said. Shall we take some air, Dolly? I find I should like to see the rest of the show, and there is nothing more we can do here. As they moved toward the tent entrance, Miss Marple cast one last look at the scene. The covered body, the enormous orange pumpkin squatting beside it like some grotesque sentinel, the stem with its suspicious gloss, and the faces of those gathered there, each wearing their own particular expression of shock, concern, or calculation. Someone in this tent, thought Miss Marple with sudden cold certainty, knows a great deal more about Mr. Bellamy's death than they are saying, and she intended to discover who. Chapter 3. Miss Marple Notices a Wet Gloss. The afternoon sun had shifted lower, casting long shadows across the village green as Miss Marple and Lady Bantry emerged from the produce tent. The brass band continued its cheerful repertoire, blissfully unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded beneath the striped canvas. Children darted between the stalls, clutching toffee apples, their laughter a peculiar counterpoint to the subdued murmurs now spreading through the adult crowd as word of Horace Bellamy's demise reached the outer reaches of the show. I still cannot quite believe it, said Lady Bantry, fanning herself with the show program. One moment he was pontificating about stems and corking, the next he was on the ground. It hardly seems real. Death is frequently sudden, observed Miss Marple, though not always as sudden as it appears. Lady Bantry shot her friend a sharp glance. Jane, you've got that look, the one you had when Mrs. Carmichael's housemaid was poisoned with the mushroom soup. Have I, dear? I wasn't aware my face was so transparent. Miss Marple paused beside a display of chrysanthemums, apparently admiring the blooms, though her mind was clearly elsewhere. Dolly, would you think me terribly rude if I slipped back into the tent for just a moment? I believe I may have dropped my handkerchief. Of course not. Shall I come with you? No need to trouble yourself. I shall be only a moment. The tent was less crowded now. Dr. Haydock and Inspector Slack had removed themselves to confer in private, taking poor Bellamy's body with them. The junior judges had fled entirely. A lone steward remained on duty, looking rather green about the gills and clearly wishing he were anywhere else. Miss Marple approached the pumpkin display with the unhurried gait of someone simply curious about the exhibits. The Duchess sat precisely where it had been, its orange surface glowing in the filtered light. The card beside it still bore Mrs. Ekins' name in neat script, and the blue ribbon hung at a slightly crooked angle. "Terrible business, Miss Marple," ventured the steward, grateful for any distraction. "Never seen anything like it in 15 years of shows." "Most distressing," agreed Miss Marple. She bent slightly, peering at the pumpkin with the interest of a keen gardener. "Such a magnificent specimen. Mrs. Ekins must be very proud. She grows them every year. Never won before, though." Prow usually takes the blue ribbon. Miss Marple's eyes had found what she was seeking. The cut peduncle, where the pumpkin had been severed from its vine, should have presented a dry, sealed surface. The natural corking that occurs when the sap dries and forms a protective barrier. Instead, the stem bore that same wet, varnished appearance she had noticed during the judging, a gloss that caught the light in a way that seemed fundamentally wrong. She drew closer still, her gloved hand steadying herself against the display table. The cut surface was not merely damp, but possessed a quality almost resinous, as though someone had applied a coating. A tiny bead of liquid had escaped down one of the pumpkin's deep ribs, leaving a trail that had dried to a faintly greenish residue. "Curious," murmured Miss Marple, so quietly the steward couldn't hear. She withdrew her hand and examined her glove. The same sticky substance adhered to the fabric, and when she brought it carefully to her nose, there was that scent again, sharp, botanical, with an undertone that triggered memories of her nephew Raymond's garden shed, and the old bottles tucked away on high shelves, bottles with skull and crossbones labels and warnings about handling with care. The steward had wandered off to adjust some displaced vegetables, giving Miss Marple the privacy she needed. She turned her attention to the display card and the blue ribbon. The pin securing the ribbon had made 2 holes in the card, one higher, one lower. The ribbon had been moved. More interesting still was the pin itself. When she leaned close, pretending to admire the calligraphy, she could see a faint discoloration near the catch, the same greenish tint that marked her glove and had stained Horace Bellamy's cuff. Miss Marple straightened, her mind assembling pieces of a puzzle that was beginning to take shape. She glanced toward the judging area where Bellamy had stood, picturing the scene, the pompous judge, his habitual gesture of moistening his thumb, the firm rub across that deceptively glossy stem, the finger then touching his lips, perhaps his nose. The tense air still held that peculiar quality, the faint, sharp note that wasn't quite tobacco but suggested it. The steward had insisted no one smoked, yet the scent lingered near the Duchess and the judging rail, dissipating toward the entrance. Near the base of the display stand, something caught her eye. A small wasp lay curled on its side, legs drawn up in that characteristic posture of death. It was an odd place for a wasp to die. The insects usually congregated near the refreshment tables where sugar and sweetness beckoned. Yet here it lay beside the pumpkin that had witnessed Horace Bellamy's final moments. Miss Marple bent down with some difficulty, her knees protesting, and carefully collected the tiny corpse in a twist of tissue paper from her bag. The wasp's head was damp, and when she ventured a cautious sniff, that same bitter green scent reached her nostrils. "Wasps adore sweetness," she murmured, echoing what Lady Bantry would later say. But this wasp found something else entirely, something harsh enough to kill. She tucked the tissue paper away and turned her attention to a small wicker basket near the display. Tables, the sort used for collecting rubbish and spent materials. Amid the expected detritus of a produce show were several items that arrested her attention. A blob of resinous substance on a matchstick, as though someone had been mixing or applying something. A length of beeswaxed thread, the kind merchants used for parcels. And a wedge of lemon squeezed dry and discarded. Each item alone meant nothing. Together they formed a pattern that whispered of preparation, of disguise, of someone who had thought carefully about method and concealment. "Find your handkerchief, Miss Marple?" The steward had returned, eager to be helpful. "I'm afraid it wasn't here after all. I must have left it at home." She smiled gently. "Such a beautiful pumpkin, though. Tell me, did anyone handle it before the judging?" "Besides Mrs. Eakins, I mean," the steward considered. "Mr. Pike was fussing about with some twine and such. Wanted to make sure everything was properly presented," he said. "Always trying to help, our Mr. Pike." "How kind of him. Mrs. Eakins didn't seem to think so. Told him to keep his hands to himself rather sharply. But Kitty Drew, the young lady who helps her, she let Pike show her how to arrange the card properly. Said Mr. Bellamy liked things just so. Did he indeed?" Miss Marple's tone was thoughtful. "Well, I mustn't keep you from your duties." "Thank you so much." She made her way back to Lady Bantry with a purposeful stride that belied her years. Her friend took one look at her face and said, "You didn't find a handkerchief at all, did you?" "No, dear, but I found several other things rather more interesting." Miss Marple's voice was quiet but firm. "Dolly, I should very much like to speak with Dr. Haydock when he has a moment, and perhaps we might call on Mr. Pratt at the chemist before he closes. There are certain questions I find myself wanting to ask about old gardening remedies." "Old remedies, Jane? What on earth are you thinking?" Miss Marple looked back toward the produce tent, her expression grave. "I am thinking, Dolly, that someone has been very clever and very wicked. And I am thinking that poor Mr. Bellamy did not die of apoplexy or excitement or any natural cause. He died because he had a habit, a small, vain habit of demonstrating his expertise. And someone knew that habit very well indeed." The autumn breeze stirred the bunting overhead, and somewhere in the distance the brass band struck up a waltz. But Miss Marple heard none of it. Her mind was fixed on a wet gloss, a dead wasp, and the bitter green secret that had stopped a man's heart beside a prize-winning pumpkin. Chapter 4. Waxed Twine. Chalked Weights. The weighing stand stood at the far end of the produce tent, a solid wooden platform with a set of brass scales that had served the village show for as long as anyone could remember. Miss Marple regarded it with the same careful attention she had devoted to the pumpkin itself, while Lady Bantry hovered nearby, torn between curiosity and the uncomfortable awareness that they were perhaps intruding on official business. "I really think we ought to leave this to Inspector Slack. Jane," she ventured, though without much conviction. "I'm sure the inspector is extremely capable," replied Miss Marple, her tone suggesting she thought nothing of the sort. "But there can be no harm in satisfying one's natural curiosity about the arrangements of the competition. After all, a great deal of work goes into these exhibitions." The platform itself bore the scuff marks of many seasons, but what drew Miss Marple's eye was a smear of blue chalk on the wooden surface beside the scales. It was the bright powdery blue used by tradesmen and workmen to mark measurements, and it had been transferred from the chalk block kept beside the standard weights. She had noticed during the confusion following Bellamy's collapse that Abner Pike's jacket cuff bore a similar mark. Not dramatic, not obvious, but there nonetheless. The mark of someone who had stood close to the weighing operation, perhaps resting his hand on the chalked surface while leaning in to observe or to assist. "The scaleman marks the weights as they're added," explained a voice behind. Her Miss Marple turned to find Agnes Reed, one of the reliable stalwarts of village life, a woman who noticed everything and forgot nothing. "It's to keep track, you see. Some of these pumpkins need 4 or 5 weights to balance properly." "How fascinating. And who performed that duty today?" "Young Tom Fletcher, the butcher's son, does it every year." "Very conscientious boy." Agnes lowered her voice. "There was quite a row just before the judging. Mr. Prow accused someone of tampering with the weights, though Tom insisted everything was proper." "Did he indeed?" "How unpleasant. Mr. Prow was in quite a state. Kept saying Mr. Bellamy meant to fiddle the results, though I can't think why he'd believe such a thing. The weights are standard, kept locked up between shows." Miss Marple filed this away. Prowse complaining about manipulation while Bellamy lay dying seemed less suspicious than theatrical, the bluster of a man who protests too much about fairness while planning none himself. She moved closer to the display, area where the Duchess had stood before judgment. The card still hung at its crooked angle, and now with leisure to examine it properly, Miss Marple could see the telltale signs of Pike's interference more clearly. The blue ribbon had indeed been repositioned. The pinholes confirmed it. But more interesting was the twine that had been used to bundle the small cluster of autumn leaves arranged decoratively. At the card's base, the twine was waxed, not the ordinary kitchen string that most housewives kept in their drawers, but the professional sort used by merchants and shopkeepers for secure parceling. The knot was neat, practiced, the work of someone who tied dozens of such knots in the course of business. Mrs. Ekins, Miss Marple knew, used plain linen twine for her garden work. She had seen it in the woman's basket on numerous occasions when they had passed each other on the village lanes. This waxed cord spoke of a different hand entirely. Miss Marple? Kitty Drew appeared at her elbow, her eyes red from crying. I wanted to say I feel dreadfully guilty about all this. If I hadn't moved the ribbon when Mr. Pike suggested it, if I'd just left everything alone. My dear child, you mustn't blame yourself. You were only trying to help Mrs. Ekins present her entry properly. But Mr. Pike kept insisting. He said Mr. Bellamy was particular about cards being neat and ribbons showing clearly. He held the stem while I adjusted the pin, said something about stopping the sap from running. She twisted her handkerchief miserably. Mrs. Ekins scolded me afterward for touching the stem, said it nipped the nose when you got too close. I thought she was just being particular. But now you're wondering if there was more to it. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. Tell me, Kitty, did Mr. Pike bring anything with him when he came to help? A bottle, perhaps? Some preparation for sealing? Kitty's brow furrowed in concentration. He had a small brown bottle in his pocket. I noticed it because he was so careful with it, kept touching his pocket to make sure it was secure. He said something about clove oil being good for keeping stems fresh. And he had that twine, the waxy kind he uses, at his stall. Clove oil? How very interesting. Do you think, Miss Marple, something terrible has happened? Something that wasn't natural at all? Miss Marple studied the young woman's frightened face. Kitty Drew was barely 20, earnest and loyal. The sort of girl who would never deliberately harm anyone, but who might easily be used as an unwitting instrument by someone more calculating. I think, my dear, that Dr. Haydock will make quite certain of what happened to Mr. Bellamy. Until then, we must all be patient and truthful. If Inspector Slack asks you questions, you must tell him exactly what you've told me. Promise me you will. I promise. Kitty's voice was small. Mrs. Ekins has been so good to me since Mother died. I couldn't bear it if something I'd done had hurt her chances at the competition. She's worked so hard on that pumpkin. After Kitty had hurried away, Lady Bantry said quietly, The poor child is terrified. You don't really think she's involved, do you, Jane? Involved, yes. Complicit, no. There is a considerable difference. Miss Marple gazed at the weighing stand once more, her mind reconstructing the sequence of events. Someone orchestrated this very carefully, Dolly. They knew Bellamy's habits. They knew the routine of the judging. They had the means and the knowledge and the opportunity all aligned precisely. But surely, if you're thinking of poison, which I rather suspect you are, the doctor would have noticed something. Some sign, not necessarily. Not if the poison were one that mimics natural death. Not if it were administered in such a way that only a very careful examination would reveal the truth. Miss Marple's fingers traced the air as though following an invisible thread. Consider the method. Nothing eaten or drunk in public. Nothing that could be traced back through food or beverage, but something applied exactly where the victim would encounter it, through his own habits, his own vanity. The stem, breathed Lady Bantry. You think someone put poison on the pumpkin stem, knowing Bellamy would touch it with his tongue? I think someone prepared that stem very cleverly indeed. A coating to carry the poison, disguised as a sap seal, additional elements to mask any suspicious odor, and the timing arranged so that the victim would encounter it at the precise moment of his triumph, surrounded by witnesses who would see nothing but natural collapse. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to the spot where Pike had stood, marked by the blue chalk on his cuff. Near to the weighing stand, near to the pumpkin, near to Kitty, who could be guided with a few well-chosen words. Come, Dolly. I believe it's time we paid that visit to Mr. Pratt, if my suspicions are correct. There will be a record in his ledger that may prove most illuminating. As they left the tent, Miss Marple cast one final look at the evidence scattered about. The chalked weights, the waxed twine, the repositioned ribbon, and the story they told of careful preparation and cold-blooded murder disguised as horticultural assistance. Someone had been very clever indeed, but not perhaps quite clever enough. Chapter 5. Dead Wasp Under the Stalk. Dr. Haydock's surgery was situated in a comfortable Georgian house on the High Street, its waiting room furnished with a sort of worn leather chairs that suggested decades of anxious patience. Miss Marple and Lady Bantry found the doctor in his consulting room, making notes in a large ledger, his expression more troubled than they had seen it in the tent. Miss Marple? Lady Bantry. He rose courteously, though his eyes remained preoccupied. I suspect I know why you're here. You're not satisfied about Mr. Bellamy's death, said Miss Marple. It was a statement, not a question. Haydock gestured for them to sit. I should be careful what I say. Slack wouldn't thank me for discussing it before the inquest. But since you asked directly, no, I'm not satisfied. The rapidity was extreme, even for cardiac arrest. And there were certain symptoms that troubled me. The sweating, the pallor. You noticed. Haydock's respect for Miss Marple's observational skills was evident. Yes, those among other things. The bitter taste he mentioned is also suggestive. Miss Marple reached into her knitting bag and withdrew the tissue paper containing the wasp. I wonder, Doctor, if you might examine this and tell me what you think. Haydock unfolded the paper carefully, his professional interest immediately engaged. He fetched a magnifying glass from his desk drawer and studied the small corpse with minute attention. Where did you find this? At the base of the pumpkin display near the stem of the Duchess. Curious location for a wasp at this time of year. They're usually near the food stalls, attracted to sugar. He bent closer. The head appears damp, and there's an unusual odor. May I? He carried the wasp to his workbench and applied a small amount of liquid to the specimen, then sniffed carefully. His expression darkened. This wasp didn't die naturally. Something killed it, and killed it rapidly. The scent is faintly alkaloid. Bitter, if I were to hazard a guess. Nicotine, supplied Miss Marple quietly. Haydock's head snapped up. What makes you say that? Because I suspect that is what killed Mr. Bellamy as well. Not in a cigarette or pipe, of course, but something more concentrated. The old gardening preparations, perhaps? Black leaf or one of its cousins. Lady Bantry had gone quite pale. Jane, are you suggesting that someone deliberately poisoned Horace Bellamy? I am suggesting that the evidence points in that direction. The wasp tells us something deadly was present on or near that pumpkin stem. A wasp wouldn't approach nicotine voluntarily, Doctor, would it? Certainly not. Nicotine is repellent to most insects in its pure form, though they might encounter it accidentally if it were mixed with something else, an attractant of some kind. Haydock set down his glass. Nicotine sulfate was widely used as an insecticide years ago. Lethal stuff. A few drops on the skin can be fatal, and if ingested... He paused. Miss Marple, if you're right, this is murder of a particularly cunning sort. I believe it is. The stem of the pumpkin bore a wet gloss where there should have been dry cork. I touched it myself and found a sticky residue. Mr. Bellamy's cuff showed a greenish smudge precisely where his thumb would have rested after touching the stem, and there was an odor in the tent. Doctor, not quite tobacco, but suggesting it. Sharp and botanical. Nicotine sulfate has exactly that character, confirmed Haydock grimly. It's why the old gardeners called it tobacco wash. The base material comes from tobacco waste. He stood abruptly. I must telephone Inspector Slack immediately. If there's nicotine on that stem, we need to secure the evidence before it dries completely. I would also suggest examining Mr. Bellamy's thumb carefully, added Miss Marple, and perhaps his mouth. If he licked his thumb before rubbing the stem, as was his habit, the poison would have entered both dermally and orally. After Haydock had hurried to the telephone, Lady Bantry turned to her friend with something approaching awe. Jane, how did you know about nicotine in gardening? My nephew Raymond once had a terrible problem with aphids on his roses. The old gardener suggested black leaf, but Raymond's wife put her foot down. Too dangerous with children about, she said. Quite right, too. The bottle had a skull and crossbones on it, and the gardener wore thick gloves when mixing it. He told Raymond that one must never touch it with bare skin, and certainly never allow it near one's mouth. Miss Marple's voice was quiet. Someone at that show today knew all this, someone who handled such substances regularly and would know how to disguise them. Pike, breathed Lady Bantry, the merchant. He would have access to such things. Mr. Pike deals in fertilizers and sprays. It would be natural for him to stock insecticides, even old-fashioned ones that most people no longer use, and he was seen with a small brown bottle, offering to seal the stem with clove oil to mask the scent of the nicotine. Precisely. Clove oil has a powerful aroma. Mixed with beeswax to create a varnish, it would disguise almost anything beneath. And if one added a touch of lemon, that would further confuse the senses while providing an innocent explanation for any lingering chemical note. Lady Bantry shuddered. To think of him standing there, painting death onto a pumpkin stem, knowing that poor Bellamy would touch it with his tongue. It's monstrous. It is calculated, corrected Miss Marple, which is rather worse than monstrous. Monstrous suggests passion, loss of control. This was planned with considerable care and knowledge. Someone studied Bellamy's habits, understood the routine of the judging, and prepared everything in advance. The method, the materials, the opportunity, all arranged like pieces on a chessboard. Haydock returned, his face set in grim lines. Slack is sending someone to secure the pumpkin immediately. He's also none too pleased that you've been conducting your own investigation, Miss Marple, though he admits your findings are valuable. Inspector Slack is always none too pleased with me, replied Miss Marple mildly. But I'm sure he will pursue the matter with his usual thoroughness. Doctor, when you examine Mr. Bellamy, you might also check for any signs of tobacco staining or nicotine exposure on his hands. If he handled treated plants recently, there might be evidence. I'll make note of it, though if Pike is a man, he'd have been careful to avoid exposing himself. Oh, I'm sure he was careful, but no one is perfectly careful. There's always something overlooked, some small detail that seems insignificant until it's placed in context. Miss Marple rose to leave. We've taken enough of your time, Doctor. You have important work to do. As they stepped back into the autumn afternoon, the village green was emptying, the show winding down. The brass band had packed away their instruments, and the last stragglers were collecting prizes and making their way home. The produce tent stood quiet now, its cheerful bunting suddenly seeming garish against the knowledge of what had transpired within. What do we do now? Asked Lady Bantry. Now, said Miss Marple, we visit Mr. Pratt's shop. I have a very particular interest in his sales ledger, and then perhaps we might discover exactly when and how. Mr. Pike obtained the means to commit murder. The saw, dead wasp in its tissue paper remained in her knitting bag, silent testimony to the deadly preparation that had ended Horace Bellamy's life. Small things, thought Miss Marple. It was always the small things that revealed the truth. Chapter 6. No Smoking and Tobacco. Pratt's Chemist and Ironmongery occupied a corner position on the high street, its bay windows displaying an eclectic mixture of patent medicines, gardening supplies, and household implements that spoke of an establishment catering to every village need. A bell jangled as Miss Marple and Lady Bantry entered, and Mr. Pratt himself emerged from the dispensary at the rear, a tall, angular man with the careful manner of someone who dealt daily with substances both beneficial and dangerous. Miss Marple? Lady Bantry. Terrible news about Mr. Bellamy. The whole village is talking of nothing else. His face was appropriately solemn. May I assist you with something? I wonder, Mr. Pratt, if you might spare us a few moments of your time. We have some questions about certain preparations you stock. Pratt's expression grew cautious. Questions of what nature? Gardening preparations, insecticides in particular, the older varieties. Understanding dawned in Pratt's eyes, followed swiftly by concern. You're thinking of what happened at the show. I had wondered myself when I heard. Please come through to the back. This isn't a conversation for the shop floor. He led them into a small office crowded with ledgers and invoices, the air thick with a mingled scent of camphor, turpentine, and a dozen other chemical compounds. A large book lay open on the desk, its pages filled with neat entries recording purchases and sales. I keep meticulous records, Pratt began without preamble. The Pharmacy Act requires it for certain substances, and I maintain the habit for everything I sell. 2 days ago, Abner Pike came in and purchased several items. Among them was a bottle of nicotine sulfate, Blackleaf, the old formulation. You still stock such things? Lady Bantry sounded surprised. A few bottles remain from years past. Most people have moved to newer, safer preparations, but occasionally someone requests the old remedies. Pike said he needed it for a persistent aphid infestation. I sold it to him, though I gave him very stern warnings about handling. What else did he purchase? Miss Marple's voice was calm, but her attention was absolute. Pratt consulted his ledger. Beeswax, a small quantity, lemon oil, and clove oil. He told my assistant the clove oil was for sealing cut stems, preserving freshness in prize vegetables. At the time, it seemed entirely reasonable. Now, he paused, his face troubled. Now I wonder if I should have questioned further. You couldn't have known his intention, said Miss Marple. What can you tell me about the properties of nicotine sulfate, specifically regarding odor? It has a distinctive smell, rather like tobacco, but sharper, more acrid. When warm or recently applied, the scent is quite noticeable. It's one reason people stopped using it. The smell lingers on plants and can be unpleasant. And if one wished to disguise that smell, clove oil would serve admirably. It has an intense, spicy aroma that overwhelms most other scents. Combined with lemon oil, which is fresh and clean-smelling, one could quite effectively mask the nicotine. Pratt's hands trembled slightly as he spoke. Miss Marple, are you suggesting that Pike used these materials to poison Horace Bellamy? I am suggesting that the combination of purchases is remarkably well suited to such a purpose. Did anyone else buy similar items recently? Pratt shook his head. Mrs. Ekins purchased plain linen twine and a card cage yesterday, nothing more. Ephraim Prow bought blue chalk for marking weights and some brasso for polishing his prize marrows. Perfectly ordinary purchases. Only Pike stood out as unusual, though, as I said, I thought nothing of it at the time. The nicotine sulfate? Pressed Miss Marple. How dangerous is it? Extremely. A drop on bare skin can cause serious illness. Ingested, even a small amount can be fatal. It's absorbed rapidly through mucous membranes. the mouth particularly. That's why the old gardeners wore thick gloves and were scrupulous about washing afterward. He met her eyes directly. If Bellamy touched a surface treated with nicotine and then put his fingers to his mouth, as you're suggesting, death would follow within minutes. Sweating, pallor, difficulty breathing, cardiac arrest. It would appear quite natural to anyone not looking for poison. And a wasp coming into contact with it would die almost instantly. Insects are particularly vulnerable to nicotine. That's why it was so effective as an insecticide. Lady Bantry had been following this exchange with growing horror. But surely Pike would have exposed himself to the poison as well, if he applied it to the pumpkin stem. Not if he wore gloves, replied Pratt, or used an applicator of some kind. A matchstick would serve, or a small brush, and afterward, washing with lemon would neutralize any residue on the skin. Which explains why Agnes Reed mentioned seeing Pike at the refreshment table using a lemon wedge to clean his hands, murmured Miss Marple. At the time it seemed merely fastidious. Now it appears rather more calculated. There's something else you should know, said Pratt, his voice dropping. The bottle of black leaf I sold to Pike wasn't full. We'd used some years ago for the church garden before switching to modern pesticides. I told him this, sold it at a reduced price. It contained perhaps 2 ounces of solution, more than enough for his stated purpose, also more than enough for murder. Miss Marple absorbed this information. Did he seem at all nervous when making the purchase, hurried or evasive? Quite the contrary, he was relaxed, even chatty. Mentioned that several of his customers were preparing for the autumn show and wanted the best possible presentation. He specifically spoke of Mrs. Ekins and her pumpkin, said he'd been advising her all summer on cultivation techniques. Had he indeed? Miss Marple's tone was dry. I suspect Mrs. Ekins might dispute the welcome nature of his advice. There was something, Pratt added, his brow furrowing. When I handed him the black leaf, I reminded him about the tobacco smell. He laughed and said it didn't matter, that nobody would notice a bit of tobacco scent at an outdoor show. Then he corrected himself quickly, said he meant nobody would notice at his stall when he mixed it. But it struck me as odd, that first comment, as though he'd already been thinking about where the smell might or might not be noticed. The produced tent is posted as a no-smoking area, said Miss Marple thoughtfully, which makes any tobacco smell immediately suspicious to anyone paying attention unless, of course, one has arranged to mask it with other scents. Pike was clever, but perhaps not quite clever enough. What will you do with this information? Asked Pratt. Share it with Inspector Slack naturally. Your ledger provides a clear record of Pike's purchases and establishes his access to the means of murder. Combined with the physical evidence from the tent and the testimony of witnesses, it forms a rather compelling picture. Pratt nodded slowly. I've sold many things over the years, Miss Marple. Medicines that heal and substances that can harm, depending on use and intention. But I've never before sold something that was used for murder. The thought is deeply disturbing. You're not responsible for Pike's actions, Lady Bantry said firmly. He would have found another way, if not this one. Wicked people always do. As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple paused. Mr. Pratt, one final question. The beeswax Pike purchased, was it the ordinary sort used for polishing or something finer? It was refined beeswax, quite pure, the sort one might use for making salves or sealing preserves. Why do you ask? Because I found traces of beeswaxed thread in the wastebasket near the pumpkin display, and the stem itself had a resinous quality suggesting a wax-based coating. Everything fits together rather neatly, doesn't it? The nicotine for toxicity, the beeswax for carrying and adhering the poison to the stem, the clove and lemon oils for masking the telltale scent. A recipe for murder, purchased over a counter and recorded in a ledger for anyone to see. Yet who would think to look until after the deed was done? Pike gambled that Bellamy's death would be accepted as natural, said Pratt slowly. And it very nearly was, agreed Miss Marple. But not quite. Small things gave him away. A wasp in the wrong place, a smell where no smell should be, a wet gloss on a surface that ought to have been dry. Murder is like that, Mr. Pratt. It disturbs the natural order, leaves traces, creates anomalies. One need only know where to look. They emerged once more into the late afternoon, the shadows lengthening across the cobblestones. The village had an air of uneasy quiet now. Word of possible foul play spreading through the gossip networks with the speed of wind through wheat. Inspector Slack needs to hear all of this, said Lady Bantry. He will, promised Miss Marple. But first, I think we might pay a visit to Mrs. Ekins. I have questions about Mr. Pike's helpfulness during the summer, and about exactly how welcome his assistance was. The motive, you see, is still not entirely clear. We know how the murder was done, but not yet quite why. And with that, Miss Marple set off down the high street, her knitting bag over her arm, looking for all the world like a harmless, elderly lady taking an evening constitutional rather than someone methodically assembling the evidence that would send a man to the gallows. Chapter 7, Alibis by Turnstile. And Gate Inspector Slack had commandeered the committee, room at the village hall for his interviews, and by the time Miss Marple and Lady Bantry arrived, he was well into the tedious business of establishing who had been where, and when during the critical period surrounding Horace Bellamy's death, the inspector looked up from his notes with an expression that mingled resignation and grudging hope. Miss Marple, I suppose you've come to tell me how to do my job. Not at all, Inspector. Merely to share some information that may prove useful. Mr. Pratt's sales ledger makes interesting reading. Slack's eyes sharpened. Does it now? Well, you'd better sit down and tell me what you've discovered, though I'll thank you not to go poking about in an official investigation without authorization. Of course. Inspector. Miss Marple settled herself with perfect composure and proceeded to relate the findings from Pratt's shop. Slack listened with growing attention, his pencil moving rapidly across the page. So Pike had the means, he said when she finished. That's something I'll grant you, but I need more than suspicious purchases. I need opportunity and timeline. Can't arrest a man for buying gardening supplies, even odd ones. Perhaps I might look at your notes. Sometimes a fresh perspective can be illuminating. Slack hesitated, then pushed the papers across with ill grace. Don't know why I'm showing you official documents against all regulations, but seeing as you've been helpful in the past... Miss Marple studied the timeline Slack had painstakingly constructed from witness statements. The picture that emerged was one of controlled chaos in the minutes leading up to the judging. At 2:45, the pumpkins had been positioned for weighing and inspection. Ephraim Prow had been arguing loudly with Tom Fletcher about the accuracy of the scales, a dispute that continued until nearly 3. Multiple witnesses confirmed this. Prow's bluster had been impossible to ignore. Abner Pike had left the tent at approximately 2:50, claiming he needed to fetch proper twine and ceiling preparation from his motor car. He had been observed by the gate steward returning at 2:55, carrying a small parcel and his ubiquitous brown bottle. He had gone directly to the weighing stand where the pumpkins awaited judgment. Mrs. Ekins had been fussing with her display card between 2:45 and 3 while arranging the decorative leaves and ensuring everything was presentable. At 3 precisely by the church clock she'd sent Kitty, drew to the lantern carving table to prepare materials for the children's parade. Dr. Haydock had taken up his position near the tent entrance at 3 tie, claiming he wanted a good view of the proceedings. Several people remembered him standing there, arms folded, watching the scene with his characteristic sardonic amusement. The brass band had struck up at 3:12, the signal that judging was about to commence. Horace Bellamy had entered the tent at 3:05, made a show of examining the marrows and onions, then approached the pumpkins at 3:10. His collapse had come at 3:15, give or take a minute. "You see the problem," said Slack, tapping the papers. "Pike was at the weighing stand at the right time, I'll grant you. But so were half a dozen other people. Mrs. Ekins, Kitty Drew, young Fletcher, the stewards. How do I prove Pike was the one who tampered with the pumpkin?" "By establishing exactly what each person was doing during those critical minutes," replied Miss Marple. "Pike claimed he was there to help." "Yes, what form did that help take?" Slack consulted his notes. According to Kitty Drew, Pike offered to hold the stem while she adjusted the ribbon. Said something about keeping the sap from running. She thought he was being kind. And did anyone see what he did while holding the stem? Kitty says she was concentrating on getting the pin positioned correctly. Didn't notice him doing anything except steadying the pumpkin, but she did mention he seemed very particular about where she placed the ribbon. Insisted it be moved higher to show properly, which gave him additional time with his hand on the stem, observed Miss Marple. "And the brown bottle, did Kitty see him use it?" She noticed it in his pocket, but didn't see him apply anything. Pike himself claims the bottle contained clove oil for sealing stems, purely medicinal purposes for the plants. And Lady Bantry, who had been listening intently, leaned forward. "But surely if he poisoned the stem, someone would have seen him painting something on it. He couldn't have been completely invisible." But consider the circumstances," said Miss Marple. The tent was crowded, everyone focused on the weighing and the upcoming judging. Pike positioned himself at the stand, ostensibly being helpful. His hand on the stem would appear natural, protective even. If he'd prepared a small applicator beforehand, perhaps concealed in his palm, he could have treated the surface in seconds while appearing merely to steady the pumpkin. Slack grunted. "Possible, I suppose, but I'd need proof." "The proof is in the timeline itself, Inspector. Notice that Pike made a special trip to his motor car just before the crucial period. Why? He claims it was for twine and oil, but Mrs. Ekins always provides her own materials. He inserted himself into the situation unnecessarily, playing the helpful merchant," muttered Slack, making himself indispensable so no one would question his presence. "Precisely," said Miss Marple. "And observe that Mrs. Ekins sent Kitty away at 3, which meant the girl was occupied elsewhere during the most critical time. Pike chose that moment to position himself at the weighing stand beside the Duchess, where he could make his final preparations without Mrs. Ekins interfering." "Mrs. Ekins told me she doesn't trust Pike," Slack said, flipping through his notes. "Said he'd been pestering her all summer with his products and advice, none of which she wanted. Called him a nuisance and a cheat. Strong words. They suggest tension between them." "What was Pike's response to her accusations?" "Denied everything, naturally. Said he was only trying to help local growers succeed. Claimed Mrs. Ekins was ungrateful and suspicious by nature." Slack paused. "But there's something else. Several people mentioned that Pike and Bellamy were thick as thieves this past year. Pike's been supplying fertilizers and sprays to the allotment holders, and Bellamy's been recommending Pike's products at committee meetings. Profitable arrangement for both of them." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Were they indeed? How very interesting. And did this partnership show signs of strain recently?" "Funny you should ask. Tom Fletcher overheard Bellamy at the pub last week talking to the chairman of the county allotment committee. Said something about exposing fraudulent practices and adulterated products. Fletcher didn't think much of it at the time. Assumed Bellamy was gossiping about some other district. But now it appears Bellamy may have been preparing to denounce his former partner," finished Miss Marple. "Perhaps to save his own reputation by sacrificing Pike's. That would provide a powerful motive for murder. If I could prove it." Slack drummed his fingers on the desk. "But Bellamy's dead, and Pike's not going to confess out of the goodness of his heart." "No, but there may be other evidence. Pike was at the tier after the collapse. You said Agnes Reed mentioned he was washing his hands with lemon, claimed he'd gotten grease on them from his motor car, or perhaps he was removing traces of nicotine from his fingers, using the lemon as a neutralizing agent. Mr. Pratt could testify that lemon oil is effective for that purpose. Slack made a note. The brown bottle in Pike's motor car, if it contains nicotine sulfate mixed with the other ingredients, we'd have him. I believe you'll find it does. Inspector, Pike is clever, but he couldn't dispose of the evidence without risk of being noticed. Better to keep it close and maintain his story about clove oil for ceiling stems. Right then. Slack stood abruptly, the chair scraping. I'll send someone to search Pike's vehicle immediately. And I want Dr. Haydock's report on Bellamy as soon as it's ready. If this is murder, Miss Marple, I'll see the man hanged for it. I'm quite certain you will, Inspector. Justice has a way of asserting itself, particularly when the evidence is so carefully documented. As they left the village hall, dusk was settling over St. Mary Mead. Lights glowed in cottage windows, and somewhere a dog barked at the rising moon. It seemed impossible that murder had been committed here, in this peaceful place, disguised as natural death at a cheerful autumn show. But murder had been done, and Miss Marple knew that before another day passed, the careful web of evidence would tighten around Abner Pike until there was no escape. Chapter 8. Pratt's Ledger, Black Leaf, and Clove Oil. The following morning brought gray skies and a persistent drizzle that seemed to match the village's subdued mood. News had spread that Dr. Haydock's examination had revealed traces of nicotine in Horace Bellamy's system, and what had begun as tragic misfortune had transformed into something far darker. Murder, that word whispered in corners and over garden gates, had come to St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple received Lady Bantry in her sitting room, where a cheerful fire did battle with the autumn damp. Between them on the tea table lay the morning's newspaper, its headlines stark and uncompromising. "They've arrested Pike," announced Lady Bantry without preamble. Slack went to his lodgings first thing. Found the brown bottle in his motor car, just as you predicted. Analysis confirmed it contained nicotine sulfate mixed with beeswax, clove oil, and lemon oil. "A complete murder kit," murmured Miss Marple, pouring tea with steady hands. Everything needed to poison the stem and disguise the deed. Pike's claiming it was all innocent, that he mixed the preparation for legitimate garden use. But Slack isn't having any of it. "The man's in custody at the police station." Lady Bantry accepted her cup gratefully. "What I don't understand, Jane, is why. Why would Pike murder Bellamy? They were partners, weren't they? Both profiting from the arrangement. That, I believe, is the heart of the matter. Partnerships dissolve, Dolly, particularly when one party decides to save himself at the expense of the other." Miss Marple selected a biscuit with care. "I had a most illuminating conversation with Mrs. Ekins yesterday evening after we left Inspector Slack." "Did you indeed? And what did our fierce gardener have to say?" "A great deal. Once her initial suspicions were overcome, it seems that for the past year Pike has been systematically cheating the allotment holders. His fertilizers were adulterated with sand and cheap fillers. His sprays diluted well beyond effective strength, but his prices remained premium, and his products came recommended by none other than Horace Bellamy himself." "Bellamy was in on the fraud?" "Very much so. He received a percentage of Pike's profits in exchange for steering business. His way through committee recommendations. Mrs. Ekins suspected something was amiss when Pike's expensive treatments burned her tomato leaves and produced no results. She complained to Bellamy, who dismissed her concerns. That's when she stopped using Pike's products entirely and returned to traditional methods." Lady Bantry's teacup clattered against its saucer. "So that magnificent pumpkin was grown without any of Pike's expensive nonsense?" "Precisely. Pure manure and compost, as Mrs. Ekins put it. Her success was a direct rebuke to Pike's claims about his superior products. Worse still, It demonstrated that his methods were not only expensive but ineffective. But surely that's not enough reason for murder. But there's more. Mrs. Ekins learned through village gossip that Bellamy planned to appear before the county committee with allegations of fraud. He meant to expose Pike's adulterated products and portray himself as the vigilant official who'd discovered the deception. By sacrificing Pike, Bellamy would emerge as the hero, while keeping all the profits he'd already pocketed. The double-crossing scoundrel. Indeed, Pike must have learned of this betrayal, perhaps from Bellamy's own boasting. Tom Fletcher overheard Bellamy at the pub, you'll recall. Others may have heard similar things. Pike realized his livelihood was about to be destroyed, and quite possibly face legal consequences for fraud. He needed to silence Bellamy before the county committee meeting. So he planned the murder for the autumn show, where Bellamy's death could appear natural. Lady Bantry shook her head slowly. It's diabolical when you think about it, using Mrs. Ekins's pumpkin as the instrument of death, the very prize that proved Pike's products were worthless. There may have been an element of revenge in that choice, agreed Miss Marple. Mrs. Ekins had rejected his help all summer, had publicly succeeded without him. By treating her pumpkin with poison, Pike ensured that even in winning, she would be tainted by association with murder, though I don't believe that was his primary consideration. More likely, he chose the Duchess because it was the clear favorite, the one Bellamy would examine most carefully, and Bellamy's habit of licking his thumb made the method perfect. Just so. Pike had observed Bellamy's judging technique for 15 years. He knew precisely how the man would examine that stem. All Pike needed was access to the pumpkin at the critical moment, which he arranged by offering to help with presentation and sealing. Lady Bantry gazed into the fire. Poor Kitty Drew must be devastated to think she assisted in positioning a murdered man's hand on the poisoned stem. She blames herself terribly, though she bears no guilt. Pike manipulated her kindness, used her devotion to Mrs. Ekins as cover for his own actions. He's that sort of man, I'm afraid. Always using others, always taking advantage. Will he hang, do you think? Miss Marple's expression was grave. If the evidence holds, yes. The ledger at Pratt's shop, the bottle in his motor car, the testimony about his partnership with Bellamy, the timeline placing him beside the pumpkin at the crucial time. All of it points to careful premeditation. Inspector Slack has built a strong case. Thanks in no small part to you, Jane. I merely observed what was there to be seen. The wet gloss that shouldn't have existed. The dead wasp killed by nicotine, the smell of tobacco in a no-smoking area. The suspicious purchases documented in a ledger. Small things, but they accumulate into truth. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the fire crackling and rain pattering against the windows. Outside, the village carried on with its daily business, but the innocence of the autumn show was forever tarnished by what had occurred beneath the striped tent. I suppose, said Lady Bantry finally, this means Mrs. Ekins won't receive her blue ribbon after all. The pumpkin's evidence now. On the contrary, Inspector Slack assures me that once the investigation concludes, the Duchess will be returned to Mrs. Ekins as the rightful winner. Horace Bellamy's death doesn't change the quality of her horticulture. She earned that prize through honest work, and she'll have it. That's something. At least, though I doubt she'll ever look at a pumpkin quite the same way again. None of us will, replied Miss Marple quietly. Murder leaves its mark on everything it touches. But justice, Dolly, justice has a cleansing quality. Abner Pike will answer for what he's done, and the village can begin to heal. She set down her teacup with gentle finality, signaling the conversation's end. Outside, the rain continued its steady fall, washing away the remnants of the autumn show and the blood that had been spilled there, hidden beneath a gloss of respectability and a veneer of helpful concern. Chapter 9. The ribbon moved twice. 3 days after Horace Bellamy's murder, Miss Marple found herself once more in Inspector Slack's makeshift office at the village hall. The inspector had requested her presence, though his manner suggested this cost him some effort. Spread before him on the desk were various items tagged and labeled: the brown bottle from Pike's motor car, the display card from Mrs. Ekins' pumpkin, the blue ribbon with its telltale pin, and several photographs of the crime scene. "I'll be frank with you, Miss Marple," Slack began without preamble. "Pike's solicitor is arguing that we haven't proved his client actually applied the poison to the stem. Says anyone could have done it, that Pike's presence at the weighing stand was purely coincidental. But surely the bottle in his possession establishes his guilt. Establishes he had the means, yes. But the solicitor claims Pike mixed the preparation for legitimate gardening purposes, and someone else must have stolen it and used it for murder. Says we can't prove Pike was the one who painted it on the stem." Slack's frustration was evident. "I need something more concrete, something that places the poison definitively in Pike's hand at the critical moment." Miss Marple reached for the display card with its attached ribbon. "May I examine this more closely, Inspector?" "Be my guest, though I've looked at it a dozen times and found nothing useful." Miss Marple held the card up to the light from the window, studying the pinholes with minute attention. As she had observed in the tent, there were indeed 2 holes where the ribbon had been attached, one higher, one lower. The pin currently resided in the upper hole, but the lower showed signs of recent use as well. "The ribbon was moved," she said quietly. Kitty Drew admitted as much. Pike told her Mr. Bellamy preferred the ribbon displayed higher, and she repositioned it while Pike held the stem. Yes, we know all that. But how does it help us?" "Because, Inspector, moving the ribbon required removing the pin entirely, then reinserting it in the new position. During those few seconds, the pin would have been in someone's hand, and if you examine this pin very carefully..." She brought it closer to her face, tilting it to catch the light. The pin was an ordinary brass badge pin with a safety catch, the sort used on hundreds of ribbons at agricultural shows across England. But near the catch, where fingers would naturally grip when opening and closing it, there was a faint greenish discoloration. "The same stain that marked Bellamy's cuff," breathed Slack, leaning forward, precisely. "And notice how it's positioned. The stain is on the working parts of the pin, not on the ribbon itself. Someone handled this pin with fingers contaminated by the nicotine mixture. When they adjusted the ribbon, they transferred traces to the pin mechanism." "Kitty Drew moved the ribbon," said Slack slowly. She admitted it. "Yes, but who handled the pin?" "Kitty says she was concentrating on positioning the ribbon correctly, that Pike was very particular about placement. I suggest, Inspector, that Pike himself managed the pin, ostensibly being helpful, but actually ensuring his poisoned fingers left their mark. It gave him another opportunity to apply the toxic mixture, this time directly to the pin mechanism, where Bellamy might touch it when examining the card. Belt and braces. The stem was the primary method, but Pike wanted insurance. If Bellamy didn't touch the stem sufficiently, he might still contact the poison when inspecting the display card." Exactly. Pike was thorough. He understood that Bellamy's curious nature would compel him to examine everything closely. The stem was most likely, but the pin provided backup. Miss Marple set down the card carefully. "There's something else, Inspector. The ribbon itself shows a peculiar quality in how it hangs." She indicated the blue silk ribbon with its fold and drape. "See how it falls? The fabric has been handled by someone with substance on their fingers. The lower portion, where someone would grip it to adjust. Position shows slight stiffening, not obvious, unless one looks closely, but present nonetheless." Slack fetched a magnifying glass and examined the ribbon. "You're right. There's definitely something dried into the fabric here. Could be analyzed. I believe you'll find it matches the mixture from Pike's bottle: beeswax, oils, and nicotine. Pike's hands were contaminated when he assisted Kitty, and he left traces on everything he touched. But he washed his hands afterward with lemon at the refreshment table. Agnes Reed saw him. Yes, but that was after the poisoning, after he'd finished his work at the weighing stand. He couldn't wash immediately without drawing attention, so he waited until a natural opportunity presented itself. The lemon would neutralize residual nicotine and provide an innocent explanation for his hand-washing. Slack sat back, satisfaction evident on his features. This is good. This is very good. The pin and ribbon placed the poison directly in Pike's hands during the crucial minutes. His solicitor can't argue coincidence when the evidence is literally on his fingerprints. There remains the question of why Mrs. Ekins responded so sharply when Pike tried to touch the pumpkin after. Bellamy's collapse, added Miss Marple thoughtfully. At first I assumed she was simply protective of her prize. But now I wonder if she suspected something was wrong with the stem even then. She mentioned in her statement that Pike had been overly interested in the pumpkin all morning, kept suggesting ways to present it better. She found it peculiar, since she had rejected his help all summer. Pike was establishing his presence as normal, making his proximity to the Duchess appear helpful rather than suspicious. But Mrs. Ekins's instincts warned her something wasn't right. When Bellamy collapsed, she knew immediately not to let Pike near that pumpkin again. Pity she didn't speak up sooner. She had no proof, only intuition, and Pike had been careful to maintain his facade of innocent assistance. It takes time for suspicion to crystallize into certainty. Slack gathered the evidence carefully. I'll have the ribbon and pin analyzed properly. With this, and the bottle, and the testimony, and the ledger, Pike won't slip through. His solicitor can argue all he likes about reasonable doubt, but the evidence is overwhelming. What will happen to him, Inspector? Trial, conviction, hanging. Slack's voice was flat. He planned it carefully, executed it coldly, and nearly got away with it. The law doesn't look kindly on that sort of calculation. Miss Marple rose to leave. No, it doesn't. Though I sometimes think the saddest part of murder is not the crime itself, but the cascade of ruined lives that follows. Kitty Drew blames herself for assisting unknowingly. Mrs. Ekins's triumph is forever shadowed. The village's trust in its neighbors is damaged. And for what? To prevent exposure of fraud and maintain ill-gotten profits. That's murderers for you, said Slack. Never think about the consequences beyond their immediate problem. Pike wanted Bellamy silenced, so he silenced him. Didn't consider that murder creates more problems than it solves. It always does, agreed Miss Marple quietly. It always does. As she walked home through the gray afternoon, she thought about the ribbon moved twice, the pin handled by contaminated fingers, and the meticulous attention to detail that characterized both successful horticulture and successful murder. Pike had been clever, but not quite clever enough. In the end, it was the small things that betrayed him, as it always was with murder. Small things like a wet gloss, a dead wasp, and a pin that bore the greenish stain of poison, transferred by the very hands that had applied it. Chapter 10. Produce Tent. Stem, Sap, and the Man Who Sealed Murder. A week had passed since Horace Bellamy's death, and the village had gathered once more, though not for celebration. Inspector Slack had requested a final meeting in the produce tent itself, now empty of its displays, but still redolent of earth and harvest. Present were all the principal figures in the tragedy. Mrs. Ekins, stiff-backed and pale. Kitty Drew, red-eyed and anxious. Ephraim Prow, subdued for once. Dr. Haydock, Mr. Pratt, Agnes Reed, and several stewards who had witnessed the events. Lady Bantry sat beside Miss Marple near the entrance, and at the center, flanked by 2 constables, stood Abner Pike. Pike's florid complexion had faded to gray, but his eyes remained calculating, darting from face to face as though searching for weakness or sympathy. He found neither. Inspector Slack stood beside the table where the Duchess had rested, now occupied only by the display card and its damning blue ribbon. He cleared his throat with official purpose. "I've asked you all here because this crime affected the entire village, and you deserve to know the truth. Miss Marple, if you would be so kind as to explain what happened, I believe the others would benefit from hearing it from someone who saw through the deception from the start." Miss Marple rose with quiet dignity. Her voice, when she spoke, carried clearly through the tent. "What happened here was murder by poison, carefully, planned and methodically executed. Mr. Bellamy died because someone painted the cut stem of Mrs. Ekins' pumpkin with a preparation containing nicotine sulfate, commonly known as blackleaf insecticide. When Mr. Bellamy performed his customary inspection, licking his thumb and rubbing it across the stem to test for freshness, he absorbed a lethal dose both through his skin and orally." Kitty Drew made a small sound of distress. Mrs. Ekins reached over and gripped her hand. "The poison was disguised as a sap seal," Miss Marple continued. "Nicotine sulfate mixed with beeswax to create a coating, then enhanced with clove oil and lemon oil to mask the characteristic tobacco scent that would otherwise have been immediately suspicious in a no-smoking area. It was cleverly done, appearing as nothing more than conscientious preservation of the stem." She gestured toward the evidence on the table. The method left traces, however. A wet gloss where there should have been dry cork. A greenish residue that transferred to Mr. Bellamy's cuff and to the ribbon pin. A dead wasp killed by contact with the poison. A faint scent that didn't quite belong. These small anomalies revealed the truth. Pike's solicitor, a thin man with papers clutched in his hand, interjected. "My client maintains he prepared that mixture for legitimate horticultural purposes and had no intention of harming anyone." "Then why," asked Miss Marple with gentle precision, "did Mr. Pike apply it specifically to the stem that Mr. Bellamy would examine? Why did he insist on positioning himself at the weighing stand during the critical minutes? Why did he manipulate young Kitty into moving the ribbon, giving him both time and reason to handle the stem?" She turned to Kitty. "My dear, you must not blame yourself. Mr. Pike used your kindness and your devotion to Mrs. Ekins. He told you Mr. Bellamy preferred ribbons displayed higher, knowing you would comply. While you focused on repositioning the pin, he held the stem, applying his poisonous preparation under the guise of preventing sap loss. He even handled the pin itself with contaminated fingers, ensuring the poison reached its target." "I didn't know," whispered Kitty. "I swear I didn't know." "Of course you didn't. That was precisely Mr. Pike's design. He needed an innocent accomplice, someone whose actions would seem natural and helpful." Dr. Haydock spoke from his position by the tent pole. The symptoms were consistent with acute nicotine poisoning: sweating, pallor, the bitter taste, rapid cardiac arrest. Had we not examined the body thoroughly, it might well have been recorded as natural death. "Which was Mr. Pike's intention," said Miss Marple. "But he failed to account for several factors. He didn't anticipate that a wasp would encounter the poison and die beneath the stalk. He didn't realize the greenish tinge would transfer so visibly to fabric and metal. He didn't consider that someone might notice the wrong kind of smell in a tent where tobacco was forbidden." Inspector Slack took up the narrative. "We found Mr. Pike's purchases documented in Mr. Pratt's ledger. Blackleaf nicotine sulfate, beeswax, clove oil, lemon oil, all bought 2 days before the show. The brown bottle recovered from his motor car contained the same mixture used on the stem. Chemical analysis confirmed it. But why? Mrs. Ekins's voice cracked. Why use my pumpkin? Why involve me in his wickedness? Miss Marple's expression softened with sympathy. You were never the target, Mrs. Ekins. Mr. Bellamy was. You were simply unfortunate enough to have the pumpkin most likely to win, the one Mr. Bellamy would examine most carefully. Mr. Pike needed a delivery method for his poison, and your Duchess provided it. She addressed the assembled group. The motive was self-preservation. Mr. Pike and Mr. Bellamy had been partners in fraud, selling adulterated fertilizers and diluted sprays at premium prices. But Mr. Bellamy planned to betray that partnership, to expose Mr. Pike's practices to the county committee while portraying himself as the vigilant official who discovered the deception. Mr. Pike learned of this betrayal and decided murder was preferable to ruin. He chose the show because Mr. Bellamy's death would appear natural in such circumstances. Excitement, heat, the exertion of judging, added Dr. Haydock. No one would think twice about cardiac arrest. Pike finally spoke, his voice thin and desperate. It was only meant to seal the stem, to preserve the freshness. I never intended— You intended exactly what occurred, interrupted Inspector Slack coldly. You purchased poison, mixed it with carriers and masking agents, applied it where you knew the victim would encounter it, and then attempted to destroy evidence by washing your hands with lemon. The ribbon pin bears your fingerprint stained with the same mixture. The timeline places you beside the pumpkin at the precise moment needed. The ledger documents your purchases. The bottle in your possession contains the murder weapon. He nodded to the constables. Abner Pike, you will stand trial for the willful murder of Horace Bellamy. Take him away. As Pike was led from the tent, his shoulders sagging, silence fell over the gathering. After a moment, Ephraim Prow cleared his throat awkwardly. Mrs. Ekins, for what it's worth, your Duchess deserved that blue ribbon. Best pumpkin I've seen in 20 years, and I don't say that lightly. Thank you, Ephraim, she replied quietly. Though I'll never look at it without remembering. Miss Marple approached her. Gardens recover from damage, Mrs. Ekins. So do gardeners. You grew something magnificent through honest work. Don't let Mr. Pike's evil taint that achievement. Later, as Miss Marple and Lady Bantry walked home through the autumn twilight, Dolly said, It's awfully domestic, isn't it? Murder committed with garden supplies at a village show. Murder usually is domestic, replied Miss Marple. People use what they have available. A habit, a bottle, a little specialized knowledge. Mr. Pike understood horticulture and chemistry. He knew Mr. Bellamy's vanity and routine. He simply applied that knowledge to wicked purpose, like gardening, only cultivating death instead of life. Precisely. Gardening, my dear, is like murder. People use what they have, a habit, a bottle, a little pride, and hope no one notices the smell. Above them, the stars emerged one by one, indifferent to human wickedness. The village would heal, memories would fade, and next year there would be another autumn show. But those who had witnessed murder disguised as horticultural care would remember the wet gloss on a pumpkin stem, and the man who sealed murder while pretending to seal sap.